All right, go for it.
Good morning, everyone. It's the one and only V, the Gorilla Economist, coming to you live with our main guy here, the main man of the hour, the one and only London Paul. With that being said, folks, check out his website, thesiriusreport.com, thesiriusreport.com. And if you have not done so already, you need to do yourself a favor and get over there, subscribe for less than the price of a Starbucks venti latte frappuccino macchiato lucachino wappuccino. You can get yourself, instead of a fuzzy frilly drink from Starbucks, you can get yourself a membership to the Sirius Report where you'll actually get real useful information. Now, you might not agree with the fact that London Paul is not a big fan of this whole QAnon stuff, and that might get you all mad that me and Paul stand shoulder to shoulder when it comes to that regard with this character called Q, and that might piss you off. But if that does make you mad, still subscribe because, folks, a smart person takes all data and all intel from everywhere and he garners it, he festoons it into what makes sense. He is able to filter it and figure it out. And what doesn't make sense to him at the moment, what does he do? He simply files it away or he makes note of it and puts it away for a later date to be looked at and to see how things play out. In this vastly fast moving, event driven paradigm that is constantly in flux, you cannot hold a position for too long. You simply cannot hold a position for too long because the event driven scenarios that we're in today is constantly changing. And this is why beautiful, well written, well executed, well spoken reports, like you see on the SiriusReport.com and the intel report that Paul gives you on a daily, is vital. If you haven't done so already, my God, cancel your subscription to Candy Crush, the Unlimited Package Saga, Candy Crush Saga on your iPhone. Cancel your subscription to that. TheSeriousReport.com. Get yourself educated. Understand the global chessboard. SeriousReport.com. With that being said, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Yeah, good morning, V, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone listening, wherever they might be. In a very, very, very fast-paced, changing world. But how are you, anyway?
I'm doing good, man. I mean, CJ has this wonderful thing pulled up. CJ, could you pull up that quote from WikiLeaks itself? I mean, the Q fans are big fans of WikiLeaks, so when WikiLeaks throws Qs under the bus, what are the Q fans going to do? It says, while we suspect the QAnon phenomenon is likely 4chan trolls engaging in a live-action roleplay version of the Delphic Oracle, it is also clear that many are aware of its manipulative potential and will usurp it if they have not already. I referred to the QAnon today as a Pied Piper operation. What I meant by this is that the operation, and CJ, wasn't this what we all three of us have been saying from Jump Street, that the operation exists to round up people that are otherwise dangerous to the deep state because they are genuinely opposed to it and usurp their time and attention and trick them into serving its aims. Isn't I mean,
I mean,
we're in June. The only person that got arrested is Harvey Weinstein. Yay.
I think the thing is one thing is, and someone pointed out this to me because I don't really, and in truth, I don't pay much attention to what Q says, but there was nothing for an entire week posted. Now, given the amount of things that are going on, that in itself seems a little bit puzzling. And look, there's no doubt Q said a lot of things that are reality of, and I don't doubt at some point, there is all these sealed indictments. They will be opened up and people will be arrested, and they will have a catalytic effect throughout the cabal, deep state, and beyond. I don't doubt this is going to happen. It's something we said way back. So this isn't a phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination. It's something we said, I think, probably one of the first times. I mean, obviously Trump was elected before I first came on Rogue Money, but I was talking on other things prior to that and saying his job is to take a wrecking ball to the cabal, and there's no doubt about it. So there's no doubt that the things that Q's discussed are absolutely correct. The problem is it's setting people's expectation, and we've said it where it's going to happen in March. No, it's going to happen in April. Then there was supposed to be something happening with the Pope in May. Well, it's nearly the end of May, and the list goes on. And the problem is, in the end, people get fatigued by it because they're going, well, things aren't happening in the order it's supposed to be. Well, no, because it isn't date driven; it's event driven, and things eventually, yes, will come to pass. And no doubt, in the end, yeah, the deep state will collapse, or the cabal will collapse in the entire Western world. Of course, that is already in process. So, but the problem is, it's become a situation where people are hanging on. You know, if you're not fully engaged with Q, then people have an issue with you. You have a problem. That is extremely unhealthy. I'm not suggesting people should say, okay, believe everything I say without checking out. But, you know, at the end of the day, we have a track record of getting things right. We have a track record of where we discuss things and they come to pass. So that track record gives the credibility to what we're saying. Well, the thing with Q is, where's the track record? I mean, eventually, yes, things will happen. And then people say, well, Q said, well, yes, Q did say things, and undoubtedly they will happen. But I think it's become a situation where it shouldn't be where, you know, where I've had people saying, well, you don't know what you're talking about because Q does and you don't know. That's not the way it should be. People should be saying, well, okay, there's aspects of this, it works, but how about there are other people who are saying things and it complements, or maybe it's something very different. I mean, the question is now, what are people going to make of this because WikiLeaks has said this? Because therefore that's going to start wrinkling people up in the process, because they're going to say, well, hang on, how does this square up? And I think the fact the comments being made is now just going to polarize people more. And the problem is, people will say, well, Q said that, you know, we're going to get attacked, and therefore, you know, and these people are just doing that. They're just proving our point. But, you know, the point is that it's not a question of even attacking people. The point I say with Q is, worse, the proof of the pudding is when are things happening when you're saying they are, and if they're not. Because if I kept saying this is going to happen in March, or this is going to happen in April, or this is going to happen in May, people will start to get very angry and say, well, hang on, you keep saying this and it's not happening. But they're giving Q the latitude to say, well, okay, you know, that's perfectly acceptable. Well, it shouldn't be. People should be saying, well, hang on, okay, you're making a lot of points, you're saying a lot of things that resonate and make sense, but you're putting dates on things that don't ever come to pass. And that's because at the end of the day, they're not going to come to pass. And, you know, the point is, I mean, someone said to me, oh, the whole, you know, JCPOA deal was a cabal deal, and apparently this all came out from Q, and if it is, okay, I don't know, but that's what someone said to me. Well, my basic bottom line to that is who are the two nations, as much as anyone, who want to preserve the deal? China and Russia. China and Russia are not cabal nations. And in fact, China and Russia would be far better off if the deal collapsed, because they would take all the trade and deals away from Europe and have it for themselves. So economically, they benefit far more from the deal collapsing. So why are they so desperate to keep the deal going? There's all these factual questions, and people need to ask themselves. It's rather like the idea, oh, well, they destroyed, you know, cabal chemical weapons facilities in Syria. No, they didn't. That is proven, because here's the point: if they had, where was all the chemical weapons dispersal? There was none. There was absolutely none. And don't we think that Assad, the first thing Assad would have said if that was true was, well, the West struck these facilities and they've unleashed all these chemical weapons into the atmosphere and killed thousands or tens of thousands of my civilians. What an absolute massive own goal that would have been for the Trump administration, and a big positive for the Assad government. And it never happened, because Assad would have done that. The Russians would have done it. The Chinese would have done it. So no, that isn't what happened. And that's where I have issues in the consistency of things that are going on. At least when we discuss things, we point out, okay, well, if that's true, what about the basis of the fact that the JCPOA agreement, and by all accounts, and I've seen a copy of something where there is a front sheet of the JCPOA agreement that has been signed by all nations concerned, including the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans, etc., etc. So the idea that the deal was never signed, But the point is, it doesn't matter whether the deal was signed or wasn't. The US walked away from the deal, and all that did was create distrust
Yeah.
in the rest of the world's viewpoint of the US, saying, well, the US has walked away from an agreement.
Right.
We can argue about whether the legality of it, and yes, ultimately it is true that the treaty should have been ratified by individual parliaments, but that's not the point. The point is that an agreement's put in place, and for whatever reason, the Trump administration walked away from it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to go into massive details about
Paul,
the St.
one
Petersburg
quick thing.
International Forum. Yeah, go
Paul,
on.
one quick thing I want to say is this: is before the maniacal mustache, there was the haircut looking for a brain, and that was John Kerry. And one of the things when the JCPOA was first signed, the haircut looking for a brain, aka John Kerry, said this. It was he kind of blurted it once and was quickly swept under the rug. I know you probably remember this. It is when John Kerry said, "Oh, the reason why we did the Iran deal is because this is about this is about the petrodollar."
Yeah, absolutely, and
He's
yeah,
right. It's about
because
saving. It's keeping the dollar relevant because we were heading towards a total isolation. So I don't know what the exact motivations were, or the strategies were behind John Kerry and what he was doing with the Iran deal. But the
and
U.S.
yeah,
we're
maybe
heading over a cliff. Yeah.
yeah, maybe yeah, no, absolutely. The basic bottom line was to save the petrodollar because they knew if they isolated Iran, that all Iran do would they take all the oil trade and everything else, give it you trade with the Russians and the Chinese, and kill the dollar in the process. Well, that's exactly what's now happening. So in that sense, it proves the point eloquently. Okay, yeah, I'm not saying I don't know whether there was some strange side deals going on somewhere, etc. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. We've said this before, but the point is, A, we don't know, and B, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't materially change the fact that the deal was put in place because as well, it did create some element of stability. I don't think Iran for over a decade has shown no inclination to want to create nuclear weapons. It was all theoretical. It was all written on paper, but it was never a reality. It was a bargaining tool to get them back into the global financial system so they could trade as a nation because their economy's been under the thumb for the best part of 4 decades. That's the bottom line and the reality to why it suits the Iranians. The point is, as soon as if Iran walks away and the deal collapses, it will create more instability in the Middle East. And at the end of the day, this is back to this point where everyone thinks the cabal wants all-out war. Well, the reality is they want the threat of all-out war to make nations capitulate. But when it comes to the crunch, they don't want World War III because what benefit is reducing the world to a dust pile for them? Nothing. What are they going to control? Just nothing. No, it's the threat of doing that then intimidates nations into backing off and backing away. And also, they'll only ever pick on nations who are weak, who they think that they can manipulate. So, for example, they thought, Libya could be quite unstable. So, what does Gaddafi do? He wants a gold-backed dinar. Okay, let's remove him. Saddam wants to sell, his oil for euros. Okay, we can remove him because there's instability. And they'll only pick on weaker nations. They're never going to pick a war with Iran because it's a war they'll never win. And the US knows this. So even if, as we said, if Netanyahu suddenly really decided to go full throttle and want to go to war with the Iranians, people inside the US administration would say no, absolutely not. It's intimidation. They wanted to intimidate North Korea, and North Korea are not intimidated simply because they have the backing of Russia and China. So does Iran. And ultimately, so they'll just call a bluff and say, no, we're not falling for this. And increasingly, and you made the point where you said nations like India are saying, we're not imposing sanctions. And by the way, we're just going to de-dollarize in the process because nations are no longer afraid of the threat of de-dollarization. Why? Because the whole basis of the whole reset is there's a whole alternative platform that exists that means that the use of SWIFT, etc., is no longer needed. Neither is the IMF, the World Bank, all these things. They're redundant. So these nations go, well, we don't have that fear anymore because a platform exists. That means we can circumvent these problems. That's the basic bottom line with this, and that's why I'm perfectly happy. I don't mind anybody. I mean, there's people in the alternative media. I don't agree with a lot what they do and say, but they do a lot of good in one sense because they wake people up to the fact that the world isn't the way they think it is. So in that sense, it's is a positive, and the fact is I don't have any problems with that. But the problem I have is when people will discuss things, and then as soon as you drill into any detail, the argument falls apart. But they'll still persist in thinking that's a reality. Well, I mean, I don't doubt one day the deep state, the cabal, will be gone in the US. Of that, there's no doubt. But it's a really long path to get there. It's convoluted. It's going to be problematic. But yes, eventually it will, and at some point the US will be a great nation amongst equals and fulfill all the potential it should have ever done. But that's some way down the track. It's not decades away, but it's not going to happen overnight. That is irrefutable, and to a large extent, Trump's doing all the things he exactly should do, which is taking a wrecking ball to the ball. But the problem is, in the process, you have to take a wrecking ball to the dollar. And the dollar's the thing that's propped up the US for all these years. Without the dollar, the US would collapse. And unfortunately, that's the problem that the US faces. But it's the only way to rid the world of the cabal. And for that, Trump deserves huge credit to actually agree to do what he's doing. Because it's a thankless task. The amount of grief he gets, the amount of stick he gets, the problem he has in foreign policy is the likes of Bolton. But you can see over North Korea that there's been some intelligent moves where undoubtedly Bolton convinced Trump to walk away from the North Korea deal. And someone inside the administration has said, hang on a minute, this is ridiculous and these are the reasons why. And that's why they're now, with a bit of luck, the summit's back on, and there's there's been a summit happening already in Singapore, and there's envoys going to the US to get the thing on track. But the point is, the North and South Korea are running the show here, even more so now than the Chinese and the Russians. They're in a supporting role. They're the two nations that have to resolve their differences. It's great if the US is on board, and hopefully they will be, but it's not a game changer. The US don't want to play ball. The North and South Koreans and go, well, do you know what? We'll just sort our own deal out. We'll denuclearize. We'll have unification. Resolve our problems, and we don't need the US to help us in that regard. And they don't. This is why. Why do we think? I mean, was it a big surprise when Kim Jong Un and Moon Jae-in met again at the demilitarized zone for a second meeting? After a few days ago, apparently the rumors were, oh, North Korea's annoyed with South Korea. No, they're not. They're playing a game. And they're playing the game to get the US back in line, because they know at the end of the day it makes common sense and it's eminent sense to have the US on board and being part of a positive process in the Korean Peninsula, rather than them having to do it without the US, because it's going to be more challenging, of course, because the US has a military presence there. But there isn't some grand game going on where, oh no, well, the North Koreans are just playing games. The US walked away because it was a game. No, they walked away because they meant it. But that's because Bolton doesn't want it, peace in the Korean Peninsula. Why? Because when they do, the US has no reason to be there anymore. It doesn't need a military presence, which is great for the US because it will save them, well, countless billions, along with all the other military bases they've got around the world that they don't need, which the money could then be diverted and spent on the economy, spent on infrastructure and rebuilding the US and making it the great nation it should be, and not a nation that feels obliged to have hundreds of military bases around the world that cost them huge amounts of money and ultimately is of no benefit to the US whatsoever. It's completely self-defeating. But of course, the neocon elements like Bolton, that's what they want, because that's all they live for, is that the US has to keep having this war footing around the world and having military bases. But ultimately, Trump knows it's self-defeating and is pointless having them.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Paul, today the markets are reeling They are right now in a tailspin because of all the news coming out of Italy. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Italy. Well, I think Italy is a very good example of a number of aspects that we've talked about from time to time. Thing with Italy is that's largely under it's the third biggest economy in the eurozone. It's very tightly linked to the French banking system, and of course, Germany's on the hook for 95% of France's debt. So, if Italy goes down, the European Union's is finished. I mean, but the EU faces three really critical problems. There's the refugee crisis, which we've talked about in the past. There's the whole QE zero interest rate policy and austerity that's killed European economies, stone dead. And then suddenly now we're seeing nations who want to reassert their sovereign rights. And of course, Italy was a great example of that. They had the parliamentary election in early March, and the Five Star Movement got around 32% of the vote. And then there's this centre right coalition of three parties got 37% of the vote. And their sort of incumbent government at that time, the Democrat Party, got about 20% of the vote. This was a clear mandate. We've had enough of conventional politics. And from the electorate. Now, of course, problem with proportional representation is you always end up with coalition governments, which can be problematic. And of course, they had to have a coalition government. Now, of course, then the Five Star Movement and League have formed this coalition. And then it started to run into problems because of what they deemed the Italian president, Mattarella, because he vetoed a list of potential members of the government proposed by this prime minister, who was the candidate Giuseppe Conte, and that was supported obviously by the Five Star Movement and the Lega movement. And they're saying, well, it caused a constitutional crisis, and we need to look to impeach Mattarella under this Article 90 of the Constitution. And Di Maio, who's obviously the leader of the Five Star Movement, was they wanted new parliamentary election. He says after the impeachment of Mattarella, and one aspect of this centre-right coalition called the Brothers of Italy have supported the Five Star Movement's demanding the resignation of Mattarella. And this idea we want to impeach him. Now, the thing with Mattarella is he rejected the list of ministers due to the candidacy of this Paolo Savona, who was proposed as a candidate for the Minister of Economy. Now, Mattarella is opposing Savona's view on EU monetary policy. Now, what's kind of interesting is that the head of the centre-right, the Forza Italia party, who's Berlusconi, who is anything but a political establishment guy now. He may have been in the past, but he supported Mattarella, saying no. This is he called ideas to impeach Mattarella as irresponsible. Unsurprisingly, you might say the Democrat Party have also, who's obviously the former Prime Minister Renzi, have also supported this view, saying it's irresponsible. Now, of course, people got a bit upset in the fact that Mattarella was said that he'll make the ex-IMF guy, Carlo Cottarelli, this interim PM, because obviously the Prime Minister designate, Conte, was unable to form a new government. Well, but the question is, okay, immediately people see IMF, immediately they think, oh, it's a technocrat being put in. Now, of course, that's not entirely the case, as we'll come to, because the other thing with this Lega party, Salvini, he demanded that Mattarella call new parliamentary elections, and they wanted a new date for elections, and basically Salvini saying it's not a political election but a referendum on preserving democracy. Well, yeah, that's a very valid point. It is. Now, the thing with Cottarella stated is that he wants a new election in Italy as soon as possible if he doesn't wins a vote of confidence in Parliament. Now, the chance of him winning a vote of confidence in the Parliament is nearly nil, because even if he comes up with this budget that he wants to approve, the reality is they're not going to support him, because 79% of the Parliament are against him straight off. So effectively what he says is, well, the government will have to resign, and then the elections are probably likely to happen from August onwards, probably more likely to be September. Now, what he's also said is, in this case, if the government resigns, the main task is everyone's got to prepare for another election. And he said the government will remain neutral. And Cottarelli said he's not going to nominate himself or ask any commitment from other members of the government. Now, the thing with Mattarella, who's obviously the president, is, look, he's not cabal. But from Mattarella's point, because of his job and his role, he had no choice but to do what he did. Because from his perspective, Savona's comments and conduct were in violation of the Italian constitution. And from what I understand, if you study the Italian constitution, you'll find that's the case. The one thing that perhaps surprises people is the Italian president has very long-reaching powers to defend the constitution. And by all accounts, that's what he did. He's obviously a top constitutional lawyer, and he's not a corrupt Italian politician. And the issue is, at the end of the day, all it's doing is they'll put in this Cottarelli in an interim role. There's going to be new elections, probably September, maybe October. And yes, Italy has huge problems economically and socially, and we can come on to that in a bit. And all they're going to do in the time being is put this guy in an interim role. The chances are he's not going to be able to fulfill anything because no one's going to allow him to do so. And it's not a question of trying to hardball this coalition out of government. The problem is they made the mistake where they should have thought more about who they wanted to put into office. And then they would have avoided all these problems. The question is, though, Italy is going to implode at some point, and with it, so will the entire EU and the euro. But it's not going to happen because the Italian president's not doing his job. And what have we seen today? Well, the bond market imploded in Italy. The 2-year, it's incredible. Last week, or middle of May, it was practically the 2-year the yield was negative. Even last week, it was at about 0.1. It got as high as about 2.5. I think it was up at one point 180 basis points on the day. So the bomb, I mean, that's a rout like you just wouldn't conceive could be possible. By all accounts, this trader was saying no prices were being quoted at one point. Liquidity in the banking system is drying up, and the local domestic exchange, the MTS, closed down. I mean, to put this in context, these are bigger increases in the yield than were happening at the height of the euro crisis in 2011. And it's likely, I don't know what it is currently because it's fluctuating all over the place, but it's probably going to be the biggest rise in nearly, 26 years. So, I mean, the problem with Italy is it's almost been priced that it's going to leave the euro. And yes, at some point it will do. All this is done in a sense is delayed the process. And, the Five-Star Movement and Liga should have thought more about what they were doing. And in the end, they would have had the governance to carry on doing what they're doing, but they wouldn't even put their own candidate forward to be prime minister, which I think was not the most sensible move. But ultimately, Italy will collapse. I mean, its banking system's teetering. And when its banking system goes down, France will have major problems, and therefore so will Germany. So it's an inevitability what's going to happen. And yes, the markets are basically pricing in that Italy will leave the euro. And yes, Italy doesn't want sanctions with the Russians anymore. It's making this coalition made all the right noises. It's merely going to delay it because if there's an election in 3 months or so, inevitably they're likely to get an even higher percentage of the vote. But next time around, they need to make sure that they structure their government correctly. And at the end of the day, people can say what they like, but the issue with Mattarella is he has a job to do. And if he doesn't do his job properly, then he's going to be on the hook for in the future where someone says, hang on a minute, you didn't do your job properly. So he's not going to put his own neck on the line to save any government. I think the issue of choosing what is an ex-IMF guy as Cottarelli has obviously caused a lot of consternation because people thinking, they're just putting a technocrat in who's going to railroad the government. But he's basically said, if I don't get a mandate, I'll resign. We'll have another election and I'm going to remain completely neutral and walk away from it and have nothing to do with it. So that doesn't strike me as someone who's a technocrat, because the technocrat would go, well, I'm not going to gain any confidence from the government or the ruling parties. I'll just press ahead and do exactly what the hell I like. when I like, which is exactly how most European nations have functioned, as we know anyway. And Italy's been a prime example of that. They've had technocratic governments in the past who completely ignored the will of everybody. Well, that's not what Cottarelli's doing. I think you could arguably say, well, maybe from the public perception, he could have put someone else in, but I don't think this is a hijacking attempt by the cabal to do anything. I think it's just a way of diffusing a problem, but it's not made the problem go away, and it's done is cause a bond rout, a rout in the Italian stock market, and the problem is it's had a contagion effect already, because as a result of that, what do we see? Deutsche Bank's share price went below 10 euros. I'm not sure, it may have even hit an all-time low. It got round about where it was. It was below 10 euros back in sort of mid to late 2016. As just a small example, France's credit default swap raised 50 basis points, because immediately, of course, as we said, when there's fear about a collapse in Italy, then obviously the risk of a credit default in France increases substantially as well, for the reason why we said that they're on the hook with the Italian banks, and therefore it will have a contagion effect if it comes to play. And what we're seeing is just kind of maybe a knee-jerk reaction to that, in terms of, as we said, Deutsche Bank share price, which going below 10 euros, etc., etc. And there are other indicators which shows there is some kind of fear of a contagion effect. Depends how quickly this dissipates, and what's the European Central Bank going to have to do? They're going to try and step in and stabilize the bond route. I don't know. It remains to be seen. But I think I've just checked now. The yield still 120 basis points up today. I mean, it is down from where it's about 170, 180, but that's still very, very high. I mean, to get an increase in one day like that is pretty unprecedented. But it shows, that Italy is teetering, and it is true. Once Italy goes,
that's the daisy chain.
Then it's the end of the
fuse.
Yeah. And we've always said that Italy is the nation that will take the European Union down, and it's almost an absolute certainty it will be. France and Germany won't, but Italy is the Achilles heel.
Here's another thing that a lot of people are missing here. The Eurozone banks go down. Guess who the Eurozone banks are intricately linked with at many levels? And that would be Euroclear and the Clearstream. Both of those
and also
clearinghouses are linked to these European banks. They go down, that could set up a trigger for a U.S. bond failure.
Well, it will do. And the other point is, if Deutsche Bank goes down, well, it's going to have a massive problem for U.S. banks in the process. So, because the one thing they stupidly did, well, not the one thing, because they did many stupid things in 2008, but they effectively lassoed all the banks together in the West, which was probably arguably the most stupid thing of the many stupid things they did, because there's always that risk. If banks in Greece go down, they can absorb that problem. If something in Portugal, and we've seen banks in Portugal struggling, we've seen banks in Greece, and the list goes on. But if the Italian banks creak, and they've been creaking for years, and they eventually just fall over, then you've got a massive problem. And then you've got all the debt the Liga and the Five Star Moon wanted the ECB to basically say, well, give us some debt relief on 250 billion euros. I mean, that's only a small proportion. So they've got massive problems, and the European Central Bank's in no position to be able to deal with that or cope with that, because the problem is, if they gave them debt relief, what do they think Greece is going to do? And all these other nations, they'll go, yeah, we want debt relief as well, because you can't just give it to the Italians. So they were never going to do that. But that was never designed that this coalition would ever expect to do that. But it's a bargaining tool to put pressure, because they've got enormous leverage on the European Union or Brussels, simply because of the fact of what would happen if Italy does collapse, because it would cause a huge contagion problem for the French and then the Germans. And if Germany and the European Union and the euro goes down, well, it's inevitable so's the US banks in the process, because they've lassoed them all together in the most intricate, complex ways that will just make the contagion problem happen rapidly. And that's exactly why it was a big enough problem in 2008, which is why they should never have done what they did, but they reacted where they did because they went, the entire Western financial system's on a precipice. Well, they've made that far more likely and far more of a problem than it was back then because of how they structured the banks and decided inexplicably to do what they did. But this is why Italy's a big problem, and why we talked about this before, and I've talked about it in the podcast on and off for considerable amount of time, is that Italy is always was expected to be the nation that takes the European Union down. And just because the government's failed to achieve its objective, and it doesn't mean it's still going to happen. I mean, the European central banks, on the one hand, breathing a sigh of relief, but also now it's not breathing a sigh of relief because it's going, well, hang on a minute. The fact they haven't been elected and the fact that everything's blown up the way it has now, Italy's as big a problem as if they had been elected and talked about walking away from Russian sanctions and wanting debt relief and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and all the things they promised. But Italy fulfills all the criteria which we said at the very outset, which is they have a huge issue with migration because a lot of obviously migrants coming via North Africa into Sicily and then into Italy. So the refugee crisis is a big problem. They've had issues. The QE zero interest rate policies killed their economy. It's destroyed their banks. And also now they have the reassertion of sovereign rights, which is coming about, which certainly Italy wants to reassert itself. And that was the whole point of this coalition. But it's not some cabal plot to destroy these parties, because there's going to be another election, probably September. And they're going to get, and the chances are the Democrat Party is going to get about 10% of the vote. They're just going to increase their vote. It's not going to decrease. It's not like the electorate's suddenly going to go, oh, we don't want to vote for these people, because in their mind, there is some conspiracy going on. So they're just going to galvanize and harden their stance more that they want to vote these parties back in, form a government. And ultimately, we may not even get to that point where that even happens. I don't know. I mean, undoubtedly, there'll be attempts to stabilize this, but it shows how easily you can have a trigger point that can cause a huge contagion problem that the European Central Bank can't contain. Now, that, whether it's now, next week, next month, next year, doesn't really matter. The point is, we're seeing a clear example of what happens in the European Union and why the idea that they could ever keep this insanity going is proved to be impossible, and they can't. And the European Union is dead and buried. It's in the intensive care unit along with the dollar and everything else. And it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And that's why nations are already looking to form the new Europe, which is sovereign nations trading with each other, exactly what the European common market was when it came into existence. And of course, that was just a ruse as they stripped the edifice back, and it became the European Union, which from a Brussels edict, which is about no sovereignty, nations having no autonomy and freedom to trade and do whatever they like, but falling under the umbrella of the European rules and regulations, which is, and that's the thing that by Britain leaving or the Brexit vote, it doesn't matter whether Britain leaves, or they can carry on having these discussions till they're blue in the face. And it doesn't matter whether Britain leaves or doesn't leave, or they have another referendum vote and it doesn't happen. It's not going to stop what's happening. The Brexit vote was a huge wake-up call where Europeans went, do you know what? Britain's got a way out of this. We're going to find a way out of it because we've had enough as well. We don't want to be part of this European Union as it were now. So it was a catalyst. It was a big domino flip in the event-driven scenario, and it didn't really ultimately matter because the European Union's dead and buried, and the likelihood is it'll be dead and buried long before Britain even eventually does leave the European Union. So it's irrelevant. That's why I don't talk about it, because it's I don't care whether Britain negotiates a customs union or doesn't, or has problems with its common border between North and South Ireland, or whether the May government is utterly useless at negotiating. It's completely irrelevant, because it's just a sideshow from what's really going on in Europe, which is the demise of the European Union.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Europe is dying a death by 1,000 lashes. They're self-immolating. It's absolutely bananas over there, Paul. Absolutely crazy.
Yeah, no, well, yes, because the point is that I mean, economically, even the strongest nations such as Germany and are going, well, hang on a minute, we just had enough of these sanctions because the sanctions are destroying our economies. It's done nothing. Russia's actually economy is strong now with sanctions. I mean, the Russians don't care if the Europeans want to keep sanctions.
And
It's like,
speaking of Russia
you
and
know,
sanctions, I guess we could segue into this. I mean, recently that meeting between Putin and Macron, where Macron was absolutely trolled by Vladimir Putin. It was hilarious, Paul. You can segue into that, but go ahead with the sanctions.
well, no, the point is with, I mean, I covered a huge, extensive double podcast yesterday for about the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. But in one sense, Macron went to the US thinking, he's going to be buddies with Trump, and the JCPOA and everything else just proved, well, that was never going to be the case. So then he then goes, well, actually, I'm going to, he was always supposed to go to the SPIEF, and then he went along and then wants Putin to be his buddy too. There's a lot of very positive developments that went on from the French perspective, but bear in mind, again, these are transient people. It doesn't matter what Macron does or doesn't do because in the end, Macron will be collateral damage in geopolitically. When the European Union eventually dissolves and Europe integrates with Russia, the chance of Macron being still president or is very unlikely because he's under so much heat. I mean, the unions are absolutely livid with him with all his reforms, and as we said before, if you upset the unions in France and you're in government, invariably it doesn't bode well for you, and I think that's very likely the case, and that's the point. There's like a two-tier sort of European Union at the moment. And the strange thing is, Macron actually is now starting to go towards the tier that wants to form the new European Union. Although the only thing is, he's not doing it from that perspective because he has his own designs and ideas, and actually some of them marry up with the new European model, but not entirely. And I suppose it's like the one thing that happened with the SPIEF. Who wasn't present there? Merkel. No, absolutely not. So that tells you a lot about the reality of Merkel. But Merkel, once again, is deeply unpopular in Germany. The coalition is weak, to put it mildly. And eventually, at some point, Merkel will become political collateral damage as well and will no longer be the premiership or the chancellor in Germany. That's an inevitability as well. But this is why when we talk about what's going on, all these events and all these things are all interlinked. It's not about what happens in one nation. I mean, removing the cabal and the deep state and draining the swamp, whatever you want to call it, in the US is a hugely important component because it won't just open up the floodgates in the US, it will open up the floodgates in other parts of the world in the process. So it's hugely relevant and hugely important. But it's only a small component of that. All these other things, when all the things that happened at the SPIEF are massively important and they're all relevant to the big changes that are happening. And every day there's major events happening that are all part of the event-driven scenario. They're all very important components. And that's why it is. It's not just about talking about one particular nation or one particular aspect. It's getting a rounded view of everything that's going on and in the process. That's why it's important because Europe is a hugely important battleground for the cabal because when they've lost control of Europe, that really essentially that they've lost control of everything in terms of their ability to influence things because if Europe completely rotates away from Washington, Washington has no support. But Trump doesn't care about that. It's not really of any concern to Trump. Remember that the goal is it's taking a wrecking ball to the cabal. The only problem I have with some of Trump's foreign policy is the blowback on the US going forward, and that is the potential risk. But I mean, if you're going to destroy the dollar, you have to take those risks, and there are going to be collateral damage for the US in the process. And then it does come back to the point that whilst China, Russia know Trump's not cabal, the problem they have is while his policies mimic that of the cabal, so walking away from North Korea and walking away from the JCPOA, they naturally have reticence about it. But they ultimately they know what the end game is, and there is and the end game isn't some collusion between the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans. That's not how it works. Absolutely not. But they know full well what Trump's trying to achieve, and ultimately, with a bit of luck, Trump will achieve that. But it much depends on what happens, I think, in the next few months, because if he gets stymied in the midterms, and I'm not saying he is, because by all accounts, his support is galvanizing in the US, but if he capitulates and loses the midterms badly, he's going to be stymied. I mean, and what can you do as a president? I mean, it's quite astonishing for a lot of people when you explain how the US political system works, because in the UK, if you're the government, you have 5 years, and even if you're a terrible government, you'll last for 5 years. You don't have a kind of midterm, which means Trump gets in January of 2017, and in less than 2 years, he could be struggling to actually have a functional government if he loses badly in the midterms. That seems very retrograde. I think that's a very flawed political system that effectively gives a president less than 2 years where he could end up not really being, well, notionally being the president, but not actually being the president if midterms go against him. So this is a big problem. I think he probably will be okay in that regard, but there's no guarantee. So he's up against it. What's he got? It's now already, well, to all intents and purposes, June. But I mean, so that's a big problem, and he's having to still deal with all the nonsense going on with the whole Russiagate thing and the Mueller investigation. Although bit by bit, that wall's being chipped away and the facades and everything's falling apart. You made a point earlier where there's been a big play that everything points to London. Well, yes and no, but the cabal deep state operations in terms of intelligence always works between the British and the American.
Right.
It doesn't mean that the British instigated the Trump thing. No, the reality is the US the US intelligence services utilize the British as a backdoor way to achieve their aims in terms of the deep state aspect.
Correct.
To try and usurp Trump. That's the difference. They use them because rather than doing things directly, by doing it through the back door and using British agents or whatever the actual reality is. Yeah. So that's what it is that they use. And likewise, there's absolutely undoubtedly the case that the British will have used the US in various capacities over the years for exactly the same reason.
Oh, absolutely.
Because
it's
they then
the same deep state.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's not as though it's all, I think there's been a little bit too much focus that it's all the British fault why this is going on. No, there's a deep state cabal in the UK and the US, and they function and operate together.
Correct.
They don't entirely agree on everything, of course, and it's clear. But yes, that's undoubtedly there would have been collusion between deep state operatives in the UK and the US to say, well, we really can't afford to have Trump as president. What are we going to do to try and stop this happening?
Yeah.
And it's a very clever way. Well, they thought it was a very clever way, but of course, ultimately the damage, and this is why I say when you start to take a wrecking ball to the cabal in the US and the US offers the best opportunity to do that of all nations, it will have a lot of collateral damage across the UK, Europe, and everywhere else as that facade breaks down and falls apart. And this is why, yeah, I don't subscribe to everything that the likes of Q say, but I subscribe to the view of what Trump's trying to do. I've never deviated from that. I do criticize some of the foreign policy, but it's because his administration's been hijacked. I think that's absolutely clear. And there's some fight back happening with North Korea. That's hugely positive. So there's a lot of positive things, but it's like anything. If Trump does the right thing, we'll say the administration's doing the right thing. If they're not, and we think we should be critical of things, we'll be critical. But it doesn't mean we despise Trump or don't support him or don't support him when he's doing things. I don't care who's the president of the US. What I care about is they do the right things for the US people. And I think Trump offers the best opportunity to do that at the moment. But if he makes mistakes, then we'll say, well, we don't agree with this. We're not. I'm not a yes man for anyone. It's like, it's like the Russians. The Russian Duma came in with some um, legislation regarding the European Union and counter sanction. And part of the legislation, which was deferred in the Duma, was ridiculous because effectively they were almost alienating European nations from trading with them in the future. And people said, hang on, we don't, this needs to be reviewed, and therefore we're not going to agree at this time to implementing those rules. So yeah, if the Russians make big mistakes, we're going to point out. If Putin makes a howler, we'll mention it. But largely, it's very hard to be critical of what the Russians and the Chinese are doing. But if in some point in the future there is a reason to criticize them, then we'll do so. But unfortunately, yeah, a lot of the focus is on the US because that's where you're trying to tackle the seven-headed hydra, which is the cabal deep state, and it's going to be a lot of focus, and it's not an easy task. And Trump could have just spent the rest of his years playing on the golf course, going, "It's not my problem. I don't care it's not going to affect me one way or the other, or what happens." But he didn't take that attitude, so he does deserve a lot of praise. But it's not an easy job. But he will make mistakes, and I think at times the U.S. foreign policy has been, ill-advised, and I hope it doesn't have a long-term blowback on the U.S. going forward. But ultimately, I think we're seeing on a day-by-day basis that the whole kind of deep state cabal apparatus inside the US is falling apart, and things are getting more and more exposed. But it's never going to be this moment of, well, the whole thing collapses. It's a slow motion demolition,
Right.
and that we're seeing it. And I think there's a lot of reason to be positive, and that's happening. But equally, I'm not convinced certain people in the Trump administration doing all they can do in that regard. I share your criticism of Sessions. I just don't think he's doing enough.
Yeah.
I think he's had
What does he
opportunities,
do?
and I mean, you made a very valid point. Why did he recuse himself from the Russia investigation? Because if he hadn't done that, there would have been no need to have a special counsel.
Correct. Exactly.
So and I support the
I
view
mean, you
there needs
also
to
made the
be.
point of the new attorney general over, I think, in Virginia is Rod Rosenstein's buddy, who's been given a blessing by Sessions. I think you made
Yeah.
that point, Paul. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, and so there are reasons to question. And what I mean, I can't get inside the head of Sessions. I don't know. All we can do is deal with the reality, and I think there's more he could be doing. Just because he's not doing it doesn't mean there's some grand plan why he's doing what
Yeah.
he's doing. What he's doing, you can't run an administration on the basis that there's some grand plan going on where someone's not doing something. Oh, don't worry, they're not doing it because it's part of the plan. You eventually have
Trust
to
the
come to
plan,
the
Paul. Trust the
realization
plan.
that that I don't doubt there are plans. There are moves to totally destabilize and destroy the cabal deep state. I don't doubt that, but it's not as convoluted as that. Every time the US does something that you can analyze and come to the conclusion it might not have been the best decision. Well, it's
Yeah.
part of a plan. It just doesn't wash. It doesn't make sense. But yeah, overall, undoubtedly there are moves. I mean, we said it way back. That's Trump's role. That is Trump's only role, really, ultimately, because until the deep state is no longer influencing Western governments, including the US, the UK, and everything else, you can't hope to achieve anything. It's impossible. And ultimately the only way you do that is to destroy the dollar. That's why de-dollarization and the end of the dollar is hugely important. So you can arguably say, by Trump walking away from the JCPOA, he's done exactly what Obama and Kerry did want to happen, because he is actually, by his actions, helping to create and facilitate the move to kill the dollar in the process. But that's just is not the actual reason why he did it. He walked away from it because he was given enough reason to believe that Iran was this nation meddling in the world, and the Iranian people are suffering And someone disagreed with me in the YouTube comments, but Trump does care about people. He does care, and that's his Achilles heel, where they can use that. Because remember
Mhm.
when he always used to come out with, well, what about the children, the women and the children being hurt in these nations? That's how they appeal to him. That's how they get him on side to come around to their way of thinking by using those sort of that strong language that is emotive to him and makes him go, well, if that's what's going on and that's what you're advising me, we have to do something about it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why he agreed to do things in Syria, why he walked away from the JCPOA, and also, why he was advised, clearly he was advised to walk away from the North Korea summit. Someone in the administration has obviously taken Trump to one side and go, you simply cannot do this. You have to get this summit back on track. Because otherwise, at the end of the day, nations will just walk away from the US and the US will just be left sort of floundering with no presence on the world stage. It's important the US does become part of this, not because Kim Jong Un wants the US to say, "Oh, we need your blessing." It's nothing like that. It's part of the process that the US can be seen to do a positive thing on the world stage. That's going to that's a huge slap on the back for the Trump administration, but also it goes some way to restoring a small degree of confidence that the US as a nation is capable of making the best decisions on a world stage. It's an important part of the process. So walking away would have been a disaster, and it wasn't some plan to make. And there's all these stories. Oh well, Kim Jong Un's gone running off, desperately wanting to have a meeting. No. What did Kim Jong Un do? He went immediately. He went to Moon Jae and said, "Right, let's have another meeting in the demilitarization zone." What were they saying? Both the leaders were saying, we can deal with this on our own. We don't need you. And
Yeah.
that's why the US has come back and someone's pointed out, if we're going to be a nation that's got any future on the world stage and has any credibility, we need to make sure we're part of this process and seen to facilitate the smooth transition, that the US can walk away from places like the Korean Peninsula and be a real positive influence on affecting change. Because I don't doubt if the US actually does things that are in that regard that will be of benefit to the likes of the Korean Peninsula, they've got great people who can make this happen. And the world can turn around and go, do you know what? The US has done a great job in assisting the process, in helping the Russians and the Chinese and the North and South Korean, and building peace in the region. And the US in the process can say, we have no reason to be here anymore. We can walk away from it. We don't need to have a military presence. That, on a world stage, that would be a real wow moment for the rest of the world. Now, of course, the Boltons of this world don't want that to happen, but who cares what
Right.
the Boltons of this world want? Because you know the neocons are rather like the deep state, whatever, and they're probably interoperable to some extent or to a large extent, become irrelevant.
Yep.
So who cares what? That's the important part. They have to be building for the future. Do make the right steps and build for the future, but don't forget the fact that whilst you do take a wrecking ball to the cabal and in the process a wrecking ball to the dollar, don't bust and damage relations with the rest of the world irreparably in the process. And if the US can come out with kudos out of Korean Peninsula, that's a huge bonus,
Yes.
that's something that could really work hugely in favor for the US in the future, and that's what we want. I more than anyone, I'm not a US citizen, obviously, but I want the US to be a strong nation amongst equals, because when the US is a strong nation amongst equals and functions well in the world, that's hugely beneficial to every other nation on the planet. And we
Agreed.
know the US has great potential to do that. And if it does that, then that will be hugely beneficial to the US as well and the US nation as a whole,
Absolutely.
but also to the rest of the world. And that's what I want more than anything. So, yeah, if I'm critical of Trump, it's because I want the US to do the right thing so it does have that opportunity to do that sooner rather than risking being completely isolated and cast into the shadows for X number of years while the rest of the world decides if they can trust the US again or not.
Yeah.
And
Well said.
it's very sad, because a nation of people shouldn't have to suffer the consequences. But unfortunately, and the one thing, what did the more than anything that Putin kept saying at the SPI, yeah, he never stopped using the word trust.
Yeah.
And it's something we mentioned a few weeks ago. trust is everything to the Chinese and the Russians. So as much as everything's going on, the US starts to get that trust back. That's a massive, massive bonus and a massive step in the right direction if the US foreign policy can, manage to achieve those
It's such a
objectives.
recalcitrant foreign policy. It's a schizophrenic, recalcitrant foreign policy. It's insane. It's
Well,
insane.
yeah, and it's deeply insulting to the US people that it's being done on their behalf.
Yeah, we should be insulted that we have a foreign policy like this. It's insulting to us.
No, it's insulting, yeah, because and UK's equally,
Yes.
response. I mean, the way the whole Skripal affair is being handled is just beyond the joke. It's farcical.
Exactly.
And and the UK's has got a lot to answer for, as have have European nations, etc., etc. It's not all about the US. Let's be absolutely straight about that. But truthfully, I think the US has far more in the future as a strong nation amongst equals to offer the world than the UK does.
Yes, it does.
I mean, I think the UK is likely to become a provincial backwater, a bit like Switzerland, and cuts itself off the world, because that's probably what Britain does best. It doesn't really like being part of anything, but of course it's going to have to evolve and change. But I think the US has far more potential to be a positive influence in a multipolar world than the UK does currently.
Absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for being on and sharing this information with us, man. It's always a delight to have you.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure, and it's a huge, fast-paced, changing world, and we try to do what we do and cover it off, but it's very hard to keep up with everything because it literally is. There's so much going on; it's unbelievable.
Yep, absolutely. Folks, thank you all for listening in. Subscribe, like, and share, and comment on this channel. Also, subscribe to Paul's newsletter as well as his daily intelligence briefs over at thesiriusreport.com. And with that being said, CJ, we're over and out. Take it away.